going. So I am going to introduce Greg Kester from the California Association of Sanitation Agencies to lead us in this webinar.
Thank you very much, Janine. And with me also is Ned Beecher from NEBRA and Janine Burke-Wells from NEBRA, who organized the event. And, you know, all of us are well aware that PFAS are an emerging issue and perhaps not emerging any longer, but actually here. And so in collaboration with Dr. Ian Pepper, who's a Regents professor now from the University of Arizona, who I think everyone on the call probably knows well, is leading a national research project really to examine the fate and transport of PFAS through land-applied biosolids. We think this will provide really critical information that is needed in order to assess potential exposures or the lack thereof, and also to offer needed data for credible risk assessment to be done. And with that, I'm more than happy to turn it over to Ian. I guess that I should say, as you have questions throughout the presentation, please type those in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. I will then moderate the Q&A session after the presentation, but I'll do it all from the questions that are typed into Q&A. And if folks could do us a favor and in the chat function, just type your name and your affiliation. It would be wonderful for us to be able to track everyone who is participating. And with that, my pleasure to welcome Dr. Ian Pepper.
Thank you, Greg. So what I'm going to do this morning is start off with a little bit of background on PFAS, not much because I think everyone's familiar with it. Then show you the origins of how this idea of a national study arose. And that really arose out of a local study that was done in Arizona last year. So I'll talk about the local study and then we'll get into the national study. So PFAS, formerly called PFCs, they're perfluorinated compounds. I think everyone knows that. They're used for a lot of household products, anti-stain, anti-grease, anti-water. The two most famous ones are PFAS and PFOA. And again, they're regarded by EPA as emerging contaminants. So some of the important characteristics of these compounds is that they're very persistent, sometimes known as the forever chemicals. They're also ubiquitous. They're found pretty much everywhere, soil, sediments, water. They are soluble, so they can migrate through soils to some extent. And it's thought that almost all people in the US have PFAS in their blood. Encouraging thought, isn't it? So there are health issues associated with perfluorinated compounds, and EPA back in 2009 issued a health advisory level for drinking water, which at that time was a combined 600 parts per trillion. That was revised in 2016 now to a combined 70 parts per trillion. And in a while, I'll show you some state levels that are even much lower than that. So with respect to PFAS and biosolids, which is the topic that we are interested in, if you think about it, there's very little direct exposure to PFAS from biosolids. The concern is really with indirect exposure. The two main routes of exposure are drinking water contaminated with PFAS and ingesting plant or animal food, likewise contaminated with PFAS. And there are some issues also about bioaccumulation. So the issue of PFAS in biosolids really started from a study in Decatur, Alabama, where biosolids were contaminated from industries producing PFAS, including the 3M manufacturer, for instance. And in a study there, a large amount of biosolids was applied to a rather small amount of land, and we ended up with surface and groundwaters contaminated with PFOA at levels above the EPA health advisory levels. And this led to scrutiny of PFAS in biosolids, which has just accelerated since that time. There have been several studies on biosolids. I'll mention 2 or 3 of them and point out perhaps some issues with these studies. So there's one here, bioaccumulation of PFCs by earthworms. This was a lab study. Soil was contaminated with industrially contaminated biosolids. We had a Nalgene 1 liter bottle, 5 worms added to each bottle, and the industrially contaminated biosolids in soil. Very high levels of PFAS, incubated for 28 days, and of course, bioaccumulation in the earthworms occurred. The question is this realistic? Another study on uptake into edible crops. This is in 2013. Again, industrially contaminated biosolids. Biosolids this time applied at the 10 times the agronomic rate. A pot study, lettuce was shown to take up PFCs. Again, high levels of PFAS, and spike studies showing uptake of PFAS. There were also field studies, again, with high amounts of biosolids applied at the 10x rate, and corn grown. But even then, the amount of PFAS taken up was rather small. And the authors quote that crops grown on soils amended with municipal biosolids are unlikely to be a primary source of PFC exposure. So let me just point out some classic research mistakes. Research mistake number 1, pot studies instead of field studies. If you're going to look at uptake of trace organics or metals, and we've known this since back in the 1980s, you don't want to do pot studies. You should be doing field research. The second mistake is 10 times the agronomic rate is not the same as 10 years at the 1x rate. It's another classic mistake. And thirdly, don't spike chemicals and do studies with spiked chemicals. They do not behave the same as chemicals within biosolids. And again, we've known this since the 1980s with studies on metals. So some of the new state regulations for drinking water, you see here in Massachusetts and Maine, 20 parts per trillion for the sum of 6 PFASs, levels of 5.1 and 6.5 for PFOA and PFAS in California. So very stringent standards here for health levels. And it's worth noting that PFAS is the only common drinking water contaminant regulated in the low parts per trillion in some states. And to put a part per trillion in perspective, that's 1 second in 31,700 years. Remarkable. So locally, concern over PFAS led the Pima County, Arizona Board of Supervisors in Tucson to impose a moratorium on land application of biosolids in Pima County in January 2020. So this is a ban on land application specifically because of PFAS. And so this is really a precedent. It was a shock to us. Biosolids subsequently had to be landfilled, and this resulted in a cost increase to Pima County wastewater of $1.3 million to $3.3 million annually. So this triggered a collaborative study between the University of Arizona and Pima County wastewater. We began this study in Pima County in 2020, and we were fortunate in that we had access to plots or land that had received biosolids since 1984, and importantly, known amounts of biosolids, the records for those loadings were available. So this was perfect for us to go in and take soil samples and analyze them for PFAS We also looked at the biosolid levels and groundwater samples, and we had the appropriate controls. So let me walk you through this slide. On the left is the field type. We have undisturbed, pristine soil, no agriculture. Then we had agricultural soil irrigated with groundwater, but no biosolids. And then we had 3 levels of agricultural soils irrigated with groundwater with increasing amounts of biosolids applied. You can see there close to the right, less than 20 tons, 21 to 30 tons, and greater than 30 tons. So we took copious amounts of samples. We're very careful to avoid contamination. There are stringent measures that you must undertake when you're sampling for PFAS, even to the point where if you are taking a sample that day, you are not supposed to take a shower. Interesting, isn't it? So the highlights of this study were that the levels in the biosolids were low, parts per billion, typical of municipal biosolids, not industrially impacted. We did find PFAS in the irrigation water, and I'll come back to that. Interestingly, in the undisturbed desert soil, we did not find PFAS, and that is a rare instance where you don't find it. And importantly, we saw similar levels of PFAS in irrigated agricultural plots with or without biosolids. I'll come back to those in a second. We also looked at depths 1, 3, and 6 feet, and you can see here on the x-axis the concentrations of PFAS, and the y-axis the depth from the surface of the soil. And you can see that as you go from the surface down to about 6 feet, you can see an attenuation and a reduction in the concentration of PFAS. So this is showing the only limited mobility of that perfluorinated compound. So the highlights of this study were low incidence, considering the long-term land application of PFAS analytes. Again, the soil concentrations in the irrigated agricultural plots were fairly similar with or without biosolids, from which we concluded that both the biosolids and the irrigation water were both sources of PFAS. And we saw, if you look at all of the PFAS analytes, 72% attenuation within the surface 6 feet of soil. We took the data from this study and presented it to the Pima County Board of Supervisors, and lo and behold, the moratorium on land application was rescinded in November 2020. So this was a very successful example of science and regulations being based on science. What a concept, huh? So this was a very successful study for us. And this really led to the idea of a national collaborative project with the overall objective to evaluate whether or not land application of biosolids is a significant public health route of exposure to PFAS. So the issue is the PFAS and the effects of PFAS on human health, and the fact that we know PFAS will be in the wastewater and ultimately partition into the biosolids. The question then is, does land application result in significantly increased human exposure to PFAS? And more importantly, will it lead to a national ban or a state ban or severe restrictions? And that idea is not far-fetched, because I just showed you the precedent that was set in Arizona. We did get a moratorium because of PFAS. The 2 main routes of exposure that people are concerned with are PFAS leaching through soil and getting into groundwater, and exposure to PFAS in crops through plant uptake. So when we got the results of the local study, where we focused on incidence mobility, and by the way, that work is written up, peer-reviewed publication, Science of the Total Environment, and there's the citation for it. But what struck me was that we had a local problem solved by a local study. And so then if you've got a national problem, what do you need? And the answer seemed obvious. We need a national study. And so this is where the idea began. A lot of words here. Let me hit the high points of the objectives of the proposed study. First, to conduct a thorough literature review of what's been done, past and present. And we're actually undergoing that lit search already. We're already working on that. We want to make sure that in this national study, we avoid duplicating research that's already been done, and that we complement work that has been done and work that is ongoing. The idea of the project is to have land application sites in all regions nationwide and look at three different things: the incidence of PFAS in soil following long-term land application, assessing the mobility or leaching potential of these analytes under different conditions, either rainfall or irrigation, and generating paired data sets of soil PFAS concentrations and groundwater PFAS concentrations. And also subsequently to look at crop uptake of PFAS analytes, again using paired data sets of soil PFAS versus plant uptake. So importantly, we want to look at a variety of different soils, different depths to groundwater, different climates, by studying plots all across the United States, both irrigated and non-irrigated. And here's the important point. The depth and breadth of the data set should be sufficient to show hypotheses that typical background levels of biosolids applied to long-term do not increase soil levels of PFAS to levels that threaten groundwater, and provide robust field data to calibrate modeling that predicts when we're going to have an issue with PFAS in groundwater or crops. So how is this different than, say, the EPA-funded research on PFAS? We think the nationwide scope of this project will complement EPA-funded research. So if you think about it, the EPA major projects funded were in response to an RFP. And so by design then, the studies are quite different. What we're suggesting is sites across the United States at which the research methodology will be identical. And this will allow for direct comparison of data and a national set of real-world field data. And one of the outputs then will be robust, calibrated model development to predict the potential for leachate or crop uptake. We want quantitative data that ultimately will also allow for risk assessments at specific sites. So other unique aspects. This is an unashamedly brute strength approach. We want to compile a massive amount of data at the national level that will provide a convincing argument as to the level of risk associated or not thereof PFAS in biosolids. And I also want to point out that we should be clearly differentiating between typical municipal biosolids versus industrially contaminated biosolids, and perhaps using a cutoff of 150 parts per billion to differentiate municipal and industrially contaminated. So how do you standardize the research? Well, we'll have all the PFAS analyses conducted by the same lab, Eurofin in Los Angeles. This is the same lab that we used in the Tucson study last year. Very happy with what they produced for us. There will be strict sampling and analysis protocols followed at all sites. We learned last year in Arizona how to do these studies and how careful you've got to be and how you must avoid contamination. For example, keeping away from any industrial sources of PFAS. So We also want to look at soils and groundwaters and plant samples collected from long-term land application sites with known biosolid loadings. We proposed doing the same study that we did in Arizona last year, sampling of 1 foot, 3 feet, and 6 feet. By the way, all of these are our initial thoughts, and I'll get to how we're looking for input from people, and we can discuss exactly what will be done with a detailed scope of work. I'm also suggesting that all the soil samples be sent to the University of Arizona for sieving and processing, just to act as a central collection point. Otherwise, things would get very messy when you're collecting samples from all over the United States. And for example, we'd also make sure all the soil samples had subsamples taken, which would be sent to a single lab for soil characterization. So, scope of work. I can't reiterate enough that this is a big undertaking, a national project. We're going to need very careful planning to make sure we're complementary and not duplicative to past and present ongoing research. We want to be very transparent. We want to seek input on the study from the advisory committee that we've set up for this national study. We want input from utilities, from state biosolid coordinators, US EPA, the private sector, and other stakeholders. And again, planning is going to be a vital initial part of this project. So this is a draft scope of work, again, open to modification. That takes out soil samples at 1, 3, and 6 feet from the surface. We could possibly change that after we review the literature. Take some samples of groundwater and growing crops, edible plant tissues. Again, the paired data set analysis approach, replicated work, samples from all across the US. And we already have a lot of these sites identified. Farmers with long-term land application plots with records of the biosolid loadings. We have the W4170 research group, which is a national group of academics that meets every year. Many of these academic people have long-term land application plots again. And we anticipate having 30 sample sites across broad geographic regions. This is a map showing some of the sites that we've identified so far. You'll notice a cluster in the Northeast where PFAS is a particular concern. We also have a site in North Carolina. I don't have it on the map yet, but we think we will be adding to these sites, and you can already see the distribution of sites across the United States. And on the left there are some of the criteria that we'd like to have for a site to be eligible. By the way, I know there's a lot of information on these slides, and that's because the idea is that I'm sure you will have access to these slides and you can take more time to go through these slides more slowly at your leisure. So the suite of PFAS analytes, these will be chosen based on the latest research, input from stakeholders, and health concerns from various analytes. All relevant analytes will be considered. So we have to develop that list of analytes with, again, input from everyone. Some other aspects of the project that are interesting. My colleague at the University of Arizona, Dr. Mark Busso, is one of the national experts on PFAS transport through soil and vadose. And he just happens to have got a $1.2 million Department of Defense grant to look at evaluating PFAS transport through pristine soils. So this is perfect as a help to our study. in that it will allow for an evaluation of the effects of the organic matter in the biosolids on transport and mobility relative to non-biosolid PFAS transport. So this will really aid in model development. Linda Lee is looking at PFAS in rural communities, including biosolids fade transport. And we're also going to be looking, monitoring other US EPA research. In fact, we're in the midst of trying to establish a meeting of the 4 PIs of the major EPA funded grants to present their findings and discuss the proposed national study with the advisory committee. Year 2, so the first year we're thinking of focusing just on incidence and mobility. In the second year, we would look at the crop uptake issue. So again, a lot of data from different crops. We identify 2 or 3 common crops to be grown on land application sites with, again, known amounts of biosolid loadings. And again, we'll try to standardize the data generated at each site so that the data are comparable. And of course, we'd be analyzing various edible portions of plants for PFAS. So how do you do all this? Well, we think we need $1 million. Gulp, yes, $1 million. And we're suggesting contributions from utilities based on the amount of material that they process on a daily basis. So obviously the size and scope of some of the major wastewater treatment plants are much larger than others. And so there's a prorated suggested contribution there. The likely people interested in this project actually are anyone that has an interest in land application. So, for example, there are 16,000 wastewater treatment plants nationally. One of Ian's fantasies is if each one gave $1,000, that would be $16 million. But certainly many utilities are going to be interested in this project. Number 2, they're nonprofit associations. You see the CASA, NACWA, NEBRA, MABA. Well, many of you are here on this call today. And also the private sector, companies that manage land application for utilities. And we've already contacted Synagro, who will be contributing to the project. So again, anyone interested in land application should be interested in this project because of the potential for a potential ban or restriction on land application. Project outcomes. So clearly a big one would be documenting whether or not land application of biosolids across the US is a significant public health route of exposure to PFAS, developing a large, robust data set, field data set that will allow for the formation and calibration of models to predict whether we're going to get significant leaching impacting groundwater or significant plant uptake affecting crop quality. Obviously, there'll be reports and a final report, recommendations for modeling, regulation, monitoring, support for continued land application for sites with low potential risk of PFAS exposure. But, you know, we may end up with possible monitoring or restrictions being recommended in some situations if you have really contaminated sites. And of course, presentations at national and international meetings. And we will be interacting with EPA as we go through the project. So far, what have we done? We've formed an advisory committee, the draft scope of work and the concepts that I presented here today. We're going to be looking for input, again, from all the stakeholders. And We have $100,000 pledged to date. And this is the proposed schedule. Fundraising, 3 months here. Planning, probably going to take 6 months. And the actual implementation then of the project in July. So I really want to point out to everyone that whenever we've presented this concept of a national collaborative project to anyone, they are wildly enthusiastic about it. It seems like a great idea. And what I'd like to see is that enthusiasm translated into financial contributions. We're working very hard to get this project initiated and off the ground, but we can't do it without help from all of you here on this call. So please, please, please consider contributing to the project, especially financially, if you have the means to do that. I understand that it also takes time to get authorization to make donations, but it would be really wonderful if any of you think you are in a position to contribute, if you could let either myself or Greg or Ned know, so that we can start to assess the level of funding that we may have to undertake this project. And I think that is the last slide. And I guess everyone's going to have access to this slide deck, so you can get this information. And I'll turn it back to Greg.
Thanks very much, Ian. Great job as always. And we have a lot of good questions that have been posted in the Q&A so far. One which was repeated by several were whether the slides would be available. And yes, they will be. And in fact, this whole session is being recorded, and that recording can be made available as well. So in order to get through the questions, we'll get to them right away here. First one was a question as to, on the Pima County study, did you determine what the source of PFAS in the irrigation water might have been?
No, that's a great question, and we pondered that. I can tell you that when we mapped out the sites that were going to be sampled, we made sure that we were away from obvious potential sources of PFAS, like some of the industries downtown in Tucson and the airport. So no, it isn't clear, but likewise, Mark Brusso published a paper a year ago on incidence of PFAS worldwide in soils. And the story was that pretty much PFAS everywhere, regardless of whether you had pristine soils or anthropogenic inputs into those soils. So it isn't clear where the PFAS is coming from.
And that relates to a follow-up question then, wondering about atmospheric deposition of PFAS and how significant that is. I think I recall from that paper that there were some national forest sites which would never have received biosolids that had higher levels than the main screening levels. Can you address the atmospheric deposition issue?
We've seen atmospheric deposition with PBDE contamination on plots. So, I mean, it's not a really satisfactory answer, but the truth of it is PFAS is everywhere. And it's very hard to not have PFAS in your soils.
There, I'll add that there's a national data set of measurements of PFAS in precipitation that came out a couple of years ago. And the highest number that I recall was 5.5 parts per trillion, so nanograms per liter in Boston area precipitation rain. and of a sum, that was a sum of several PFAS. So there are other studies published from internationally showing PFAS in precipitation as well.
Great. And another question, Ian, is whether the participants in the study would be able to remain anonymous.
Yes,
And would they be able still, though, to get results of any testing
yes.
directly? Okay. And another one was, how does one become a participant in the study? And a follow-up to that was, for any testing, who would cover the cost for that?
Well, that's what we're raising the funding for. The vast majority of the funding would go towards PFAS analysis. In terms of how do you get involved in the study, initially contact either myself, Greg, or Ned, and we will start putting it together. One of the issues has been it's difficult to come up with a lot of details on exactly how we're going to do things until we know the level of funding that we have. Once we know the level of funding that we have, we can be much more precise in terms of what sites we're going to look at, where we're going to do it, and how we're going to do it.
Right.
And I would agree that it's important to recognize that we'll be the project, if it moves forward, will be assessing what the literature has shown and assessing what sites have been suggested and may be available, and their history and the robustness of the information about past biosolids use. What we're looking for and at are sites that have been used for a long time, so we can collect field data based on known applications, and so it's not really going to be a screening necessarily of current biosolids and testing of myriad current biosolids. So just to be sort of clear on that, if you're looking to have your biosolids tested, the study would not necessarily be the way to go about it.
Right. Another one was whether or not there is a PR, a public relations component considered as part of the study to ensure that the scientific findings are available to local decision makers as well as state and local regulators.
Yes, clearly the data will be transmitted in various ways to the public, all the way from scientific meetings nationally and internationally to using extension outreaches. Yeah, we will want to get the data out far and wide as possible. It's certainly not going to be just an academic exercise. And I should mention that I have experience of working with utilities and the private sector, in that I had a National Science Foundation Industry University Cooperative Research Center for 20 years, at which we were taking membership fees to do research of interest to the members that contributed those funds, and very successful in getting that information translated into ways that the public can assimilate. And
I had responded some to that online question as well, and I would just add that at the same time, the scope of this project is pretty huge, and so while there will be good communications, which is typical for a large, powerful research project, additional outreach and communications, and to all stakeholders, really will probably be the responsibility of others to take the results of this and do what you will with it. So don't at least I will argue in the discussions and planning for this that we focus on getting the data and having it be robust, and communications can be further communications can be done by others.
And we can help with that. So for example, if you think of the slide deck that I just presented today, I would put it to you that we could give that slide deck to pretty much anyone, and I think they would be able quite easily to do a decent job of presenting that information locally to their group in their state or wherever they were.
Right. Another question that I thought was very intriguing was someone wanted to know whether an individual could provide funding and whether that would be tax deductible.
Boy, I don't know the answer to that one. Any ideas, Ned? Greg?
I think you need to consult your tax lawyer. I don't know that. I guess it would depend on where the funds went. So if it goes to a nonprofit, and possibly the university could be a nonprofit charitable branch or something. So it would depend on that. So it's partly how the funding structure is set up, but we can look into that.
Yeah,
We'll find a way.
I think an individual could certainly contribute, whether it's tax deductible or not is the question. Then there was a question as to whether your Pima County study was looking at Class A or Class B biosolids, and whether you would anticipate any differences between the two.
It was Class B biosolids, and I would not think there would be any difference between Class A and Class B.
Right. And here is an interesting one, wondering if there will be protocols put in place to account for conflict of interest between perhaps funders of the study and their stakes in the results. Will there be a third-party monitor involved?
The only thing I would say to that is that we will be very transparent, and certainly the scientific integrity that we will display will be top-notch. That's not an issue that I would worry about.
Yeah. And then another question was which crops, or how will we decide what crops are looked at for the crop uptake part of the study?
One criteria would be the ability for it to be grown all over the country, so that we can compare the results. And we did a national study when metals were an issue 30, 40 years ago, and it seems like wheat was one of the crops then, but maybe some hay crops. Ned, you got any ideas on that one?
Say that again. Sorry.
You got any thoughts on choice of crops nationally?
Yeah, we have, from our National Biosolids Data Project, we have a sense of which crops are being used most for biosolids. And at this point, feed corn and hay, grass hay crops get the most biosolids. So I think it'll depend, we'd want to ensure that we're prioritizing those that are highly, more commonly used. But it will also depend on the sites themselves, what crops are being grown at the time, in order to take tissue culture, tissue samples for PFAS testing. So, so I would think, and again, this is something that will be worked on as we design the project, but I would think that we would look at sites, choose good sites, and then see what is being grown, and then try to make sure that we're covering the major kinds of crops that are grown biosolids.
Which interestingly enough would not include any food crops. Just because there are virtually no food crops that are grown with biosolids, even though that is what typically the research is done on. But so we may have to look at that, but if
Yeah.
you're looking at those crops most often used, it would not. A point was made here from someone in Vermont saying that there was a recent study of PFAS background soils in Vermont, and they found a median concentration of 0.7 parts per billion in shallow soils, and they provided a link to that, which is instructive.
So that's a pristine soil, Greg?
Those
That's
are
what it-
randomly selected soils from a variety of sites in Vermont and mostly considered non-industrially impacted, yeah.
Yeah. And let's see.
I have a question here from Jake. How will other agricultural inputs such as commercial fertilizers, herbicides, pesticides, etc., be differentiated from biosolids in the study? Many farms use commercial products in rotation with biosolids, and there are products used on farms, of course, that may contain PFAS. We've done a bit of a literature review, and that will be part of it, to understand what other potential sources there are of PFAS on farms generally. And then also we'll look specifically at the farms in question or the sites being used to try to exclude any obvious sources of other contamination.
And the other thing is that concept of a brute strength approach, compiling a massive amount of data, I think will allow for the big pictures to evolve and be seen. So
There's another good question. Today's biosolids likely have significantly lower levels of PFAS than biosolids produced several years ago. And how would the study distinguish such data to support the future use of biosolids?
well, we'd be looking essentially at the total amount of PFAS in the soil, regardless of, whether most of it came from 20 years ago or recently. But there should be correlations, you would think, between the amounts of the PFAS in the soil and any mobility or transport of those PFAS analytes and any PFAS concentrations in groundwater.
Uh-huh.
And we have to know, we obviously can't know what the past levels were from direct measurement of biosolids unless, and this is a possibility in some instances, there are frozen samples that we can go back and analyze. But it is possible to back calculate from soil levels if you know the tonnages of biosolids applied total, and you think, when you make the assumption that that's the significant major source of PFAS, you can back calculate levels. And there are a few published research papers that have measured some historic biosolids levels, such as the one from Halden.
We know they're lower now than they were.
Yeah, they're lower now than they were, and that's true with human blood levels too, for PFOA and PFOS, because of their phase out.
And here's another good question that you mentioned that the PIs of the current EPA grant projects will be consulted for input on how this work will complement theirs. And the comment is that this feedback will help in getting support for this project. What approach will we use to share that feedback information with potential funders?
Run that last bit by again, Greg.
Well, if we are working with the PIs of the recent EPA grants,
Yeah.
as we have proposed, the question is, how will feedback from that consultation be communicated to potential funders so that they are given assurance that we are complementary and not duplicative?
Well, I'm sure anyone that is interested in the project, and particularly anyone contributing to the project, will be on a listserv and we'll get the same information that everyone else gets. So I think we can accommodate that problem quite easily.
Right. And
I have a question here from Barb, and I'm just asking about if the project was funded today, what is the expected timeline for results? The goal at this point, again, design is not final, is to have the project last for 2 growing seasons, 2 years essentially. And then of course there would be data analysis and publication of results. It would take another probably 6 months.
Yeah,
And I see Greg Ivanilo made a good point in that a true risk assessment for plant uptake would quantify future potential risky crops that might be grown if the site would be converted to commercial or homeowner vegetable crops as a reason to do food crops, direct human consumption food crops. So that is something certainly to be taken into consideration.
so
I
one of
understand that.
the things I'd like to throw out is this is a massive undertaking that we're proposing. It's also a massive opportunity, and it's an opportunity for people to think outside the box and answer questions that heretofore have been no answer to them. And I think we can, as a national group, design a study that provides a lot of new information on land application. And of course, PFAS.
And I agree. Also, there's a question, and I'm at fault here for perhaps having you delete this slide, but what compounds are you considering to analyze? And will you consider either top or TOF analyses?
What was the kind of analyses?
The top and TOF analyses, TOP, TOF,
Yeah.
Oh, fluorine.
yeah, precursors.
You're talking about soil analysis or PFAS?
Well, for PFAS in the soil.
Yeah, we'll of course get all the major ones for sure. PFAS and PFOA will be at the top of the list. But we'll
develop,
consult
We'll be able to
several-
develop additional, that full list as the final design, because it's advancing so quickly. The
Right.
available, commercially available list is growing all the time based on analytical standards.
And that was why I asked that slide be deleted, because I think it's not going to be current by the time we do it.
And regarding total fluorine analyses, those kinds of things, again, we'll have discussion, certainly welcome input on it. But there's question as to whether total fluorine has value as an analysis, and it may not be worth additional cost. Whereas top analysis may be more useful in going after precursors, understanding those. Dr. Linda Lee at Purdue is very much focused on that, and to what extent we spend project funds on going after those information, it may just be duplicative, useful data, so it may not be worth it.
And here is a point saying this is a great proposal and they support it, and wondering how the schedule for this project relates to EPA's schedule to complete their risk assessment in 2024. Would we ask them to hold off on that? I don't.
Two things. One, I don't know the EPA schedule. We will once we've met with them. And secondly, I doubt strongly whether we would ask them to hold off.
Yeah.
I see here that Steve, friend Steve at Sanborn Head has asked how you're differentiating biosolids from wastewater treatment plants that are industrially impacted and those from others. So data collected already has indicated that, and Michigan in particular has sort of identified this concept of industrially impacted versus kind of background level PFAS in biosolids. And the background levels tend to be in the low single to tens of parts per billion.
Correct.
of PFAS, whereas industrially impacted ones are, above 100, 150 is what Michigan uses. So at this point, the hypothesis is, and data so far are suggesting that, a large majority of biosolids are testing at background levels, and the number of industrially impacted biosolids are relatively small in number, but that's the kind of thing we hope this study will help us better understand.
Here's a question that we definitely want to answer. To whom should contributions be sent?
I was originally thinking of having it sent through to the University of Arizona, and there's two reasons for that. One, we need a central collection point, or else things are going to get incredibly messy. And two, again, I've had 20 years of experience of collecting funds from the utilities and the private sector from all over the country, and then coordinating and conducting research with those funds. So I'm not starting from ground zero from that aspect. And of course, the critical thing will be that everything is very transparent in terms of where the money's going and how it's spent.
And I would say
you have support there as well, through your financial offices and all that.
Yes.
So I think that's an important part of the transparency.
and a very low overhead administrative fee, which is very unusual for these types of projects. You want to talk about that a moment, Ian?
Yeah, one idea was, again, I've run a industry university cooperative research center for 20 years. And with that center, we have a 10% indirect costs. And the full indirect cost rate at the University of Arizona is, I think it's 53%. At MIT, I think it's 120%, which is insane. So 10% is about as low as you can go.
Yeah, it's remarkably low, makes it very efficient. A follow-up question on whether or not we were going to have a PR component was someone just saying that it would be much easier for them to contribute if they knew that credible third parties like yourself would be able to speak to their local or state regulators.
Yep.
I guess, with the findings. And I think
we can do that. Just wind me up and set me off.
Yeah.
And, many people on the advisory board are very familiar with presenting information at all levels, top-notch scientific meetings, but also grassroots out with the general public. And I think we would have a lot of spokespeople just from the advisory committee.
Right.
I have here a question on, can you explain where the reference that 100-time or a 10-time application rate in research is not the same as 10 years of application at a one-time rate?
Because pollution occurs when you add pollutants or chemicals or compounds at a rate at which the environment cannot assimilate it. So think about free-range cattle in Arizona. You need about 20 acres for one cow. Compare that with a concentrated animal feedlot operation where you have 100,000 animals. You're just overwhelming. It's like, think of inorganic fertilizer. You're going to put 10 times as much on? You're not going to get any plants to grow if you do that. So it's just not the same.
Great, thank you. We have someone else who asked, what are the major sources of PFAS? And there are many. There are other questions in the chat that sort of refer to additional sort of questions of that sort of a broad nature on the PFAS issue, such as where they come from and whether they come from overseas and things like that. And we could spend time on trying to answer all those different things, but I think contact us offline and we'll get you the answers to those things.
And the quick answer is, if you want to avoid a lot of exposure, get rid of all the carpets in your house. Get rid of household dust.
And how about Teflon?
Yeah.
There was another question here saying that they may have missed it, but is this only a soil study or will we sample groundwater within the area where biosolids have been applied? Saying that newer short chain PFAS may be more mobile.
We'd love to sample groundwater as well. I think,
And
again,
that's part of it.
paired data sets would be great.
Yeah. And then another question here was whether or not we could provide a formal letter or email to request donations with a summary of the purpose, timeline for the study so they can run it up their chain of command. I think we've kind of done that already, but we may be able to do something a little more formally.
Or we could flip that around. Anyone interested in assessing whether they can contribute or not, if you email us the name and the person to whom we should address the information, we can do it.
Yeah.
I think one thing we're learning from the questions in the Q&A is that there will be different needs for different funders, and we will be glad to work with you to meet your needs. For example, that question about charitable status, whether a donation can be tax deductible. So we'll work with you. Reach out to us. We'll each put our emails. We're in that final thing, but we'll put them back. We'll put them in the chat now as well, so you can contact us if needed.
And that questioner had a follow-up saying that it would not just be a question for individuals, but also for private companies or corporations. Again, I'm sure that they could contribute, whether it is tax deductible, I don't know.
I'll try and get some information from the University of Arizona administrative folk. There's got to be people. I'll contact the foundation because they must deal with that question all the time.
Now, I have a practical question for Janine in terms of there have been a lot of folks who would like a copy of the slides, and we don't necessarily know everyone who joined us today because we didn't have a registration. Is there a way that we can get it to them, or should we make it available somewhere?
We could do both, Greg. I think I have access to the email addresses for folks as they logged on. So I could do an email blast, and then we could also post it on all of our websites.
That'd be great. Thank you. And
There's a question here about whether EPA and WAF are contributing to the funding. At this point, decision hasn't been made on that. EPA is unlikely to because they have their formal processes, but others are, other organizations, including WAF, are considering. There's also a question that came in about why only some cities are identified in the map. I think that map is in one of the slides showing possible locations for the study. And I think it was just a map. It wasn't necessarily indicating anything if there was a particular name of a city on it or not. Is that right?
Those are just people that have contacted me and said, hey, we have sites with known amounts of biosolids that could be part of the study.
right. And actually, that was not Sacramento that was shown in California. It's just sort of in that area. Here's another good question is, how will we perform public health exposure comparisons to other common sources of PFAS that contribute to blood serum levels? I don't know if that's possible, but
Yeah,
That I would say is, beyond the scope of the project, that we can't, we have to narrow the scope to do what we're
Yeah.
hoping to do is a huge thing at this point, in and of itself. And that's to collect a robust, large data set. And then we leave the rest to others who have greater expertise, especially when it comes to human health.
yeah. Well, I think that we have hit our time zone. Does that, I'm not sure if there are additional questions or not now.
I could get those questions, Greg, and make sure we've answered them all. And if we haven't, we can follow up directly with the folks who asked them.
Okay.
And someone had suggested something about maybe folks donating to NEBRA, and NEBRA passing on donations to the project. Yeah, whatever we can do to facilitate this important study.
Although I do think it will be better if we can have one recipient, hopefully Arizona, just so that it's, a smoother, process, and less burden on NEBRA and others, and it's more
Appreciate it.
direct. Yeah, it's
Appreciate it.
much more direct if it goes to a single source, and I think Arizona should be that source.
My guess is it's a nonprofit, and thus tax deductible, but we'll see.
All right, well, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. Thank you very much, Ian. Great presentation, and look forward to working on the project. Thanks, Ned, for all your help. Janine for setting this up and moderating and organizing it. Thanks a lot, everyone.
Ned, Greg, and Janine,